Traore left European diplomat frozen after insulting comment. What happened next shocked everyone. A tense diplomatic meeting was about to begin in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. As Ibrahim Traore prepared to receive European Union Representative Gustav Hoffman, no one could have predicted that the words from the European diplomat's mouth would escalate into an international crisis. Hoffman, upon entering Traore's office, made his fatal mistake with a smile. The atmosphere in the meeting room was electric. On one side sat Ibrahim Traore, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, and on the other side, Gustav Hoffman, the EU's special representative for African affairs. Between them on the large table lay documents for an agricultural aid agreement expected to be signed between the EU and Burkina Faso. Hoffman's extremely self-assured demeanor only increased the tension in the room. "Mr. Traore," said Hoffman, with a slight smile, "this agreement is a great opportunity for the people of Burkina Faso. With the €50 million agricultural support package, you can alleviate the food crisis in your country. Of course, there will be some conditions." Traore listened without showing any expression. His silence encouraged Hoffman to continue talking. "First, a fund will be established under the management of the European Development Bank. Second, French and German agricultural experts will manage the process. And finally, you will need to review your agreements with Russian and Chinese companies." The Burkina Faso leader calmly asked, "So the European Union is helping us but limiting our economic independence, is that right?" Hoffman laughed lightly. "Mr. Traore, independence is a nice concept, but in the global world no one is completely independent. A developing country like yours needs more experienced economic partners." The condescending tone in Hoffman's voice caused the Burkinabe officials in the room to grimace. However, Traore still appeared calm. "An interesting perspective," said Traore. "Please continue." The European diplomat leaned back in his chair, relieved. "Look, let's be frank. Africa's problem has been trying to govern itself for too long. Without European models and supervision, this continent will never realize its potential. You need to understand this, Mr. Traore. That's why, as an officer educated in Paris, your embrace of European values gives us hope. Real development will come to Africa only through Europe's guidance." A deep silence fell over the meeting room. The Burkinabe officials were frozen, looking at each other in shock. Even the EU advisors next to Hoffman looked uncomfortable. Traore slowly stood up. For about a minute, he said nothing, just looked at Hoffman. The European diplomat began to fidget, uncomfortable with this unexpected silence. "Mr. President," said Hoffman, trying to hide his nervousness, "was there something in my words that bothered you?" Traore picked up the coffee cup on the table and took a sip. Then, in a very calm voice, he began to speak. "Mr. Hoffman, I want to tell you a story. In 1892, French colonizers came to my grandfather's village. They said they were bringing civilization. They promised to offer guidance. And then do you know what happened? They forced all the men in the village to work, humiliated the women, and condemned the children to starvation. My grandfather began working in a mine at the age of 12 under the name of guidance." Hoffman tried to interject. "Mr. President, that's in the past." "Don't interrupt," said Traore, his voice still calm but now like steel. "I'm not finished. That guidance continued until the 1960s, and then so-called independence. But economic dependence continued. France continued to control our central bank. Our natural resources still flowed to European companies. And now, in 2025, you're still telling the same story. Guidance, supervision, European models." Traore tapped the table lightly. "No more, Mr. Hoffman, no more." Hoffman's face began to redden. "Mr. President, you misunderstood. I was just trying to emphasize Europe's support for Africa." Traore raised his hand to stop him. "We are not small children, Mr. Hoffman. And you are not our teacher. Burkina Faso is an independent country and is ready to cooperate on equal terms. But this is not what you're proposing. You're still speaking with a colonial mindset." The other European diplomats in the room began to shift uncomfortably. Hoffman was stunned. He hadn't expected such a reaction. Look, perhaps my way of expressing myself was wrong. I apologize if we want respect, not apologies, said Traore. Thank you for your €50 million agricultural support, but we cannot accept your terms. Burkina Faso will make its own decisions. Hoffman still couldn't believe it. Are you saying you're rejecting it? Without this aid, how will you finance your agricultural projects in Burkina Faso? Traore smiled, this time a genuine smile. Here's a real surprise for you, Mr. Hoffman. We've already launched our own agricultural program. We call it Daam. It means to take root in our local language. We're providing equipment, seeds, and training to small farmers in our country. And we're doing it with our own resources. Hoffman's surprise was growing. But how? According to our reports, Burkina Faso doesn't have sufficient resources for such a program. Your reports are wrong, said Traore, then took a file and handed it to Hoffman. Here are the 6-month results of our Daam program. 30% increase in production, 15% decrease in food imports, and most importantly, a visible improvement in the quality of life in villages. Hoffman opened the file and looked at the data. They were indeed impressive results. But where did you find the funding? We reorganized the management of our gold mines, said Traore. Now a larger portion of the profits stays in our country, and we use these resources for the benefit of our people. Hoffman's face had now completely paled. The rejection of the support offered by the EU was a scandal in itself, but worse still was Burkina Faso showing that it didn't need this support. Mr. President, said Hoffman, trying to control his voice, perhaps we can renegotiate this agreement. We can review the terms. No need, said Traore in a definitive voice. We are open to equal partnerships, but new colonialism under the name of guidance and supervision is unacceptable. Now the meeting is over. Traore stood up to leave the room. As he was walking toward the door, Hoffman's stunned voice was heard. But what about your agreements with Russia and China? Are you rejecting them too? Traore stopped at the door and turned around. We are not against any country, Mr. Hoffman. Not Europe, not Russia, not China. We are only for Burkina Faso. And now we make our own decisions. Later that same day, as Gustav Hoffman was returning to Brussels, he was thinking about how to explain what happened at the meeting to the EU Commission. The rejection of the €50 million agreement would be a major stain on his career. Moreover, the fact that Burkina Faso was successfully running its own agricultural program could cause all their African strategies to be questioned. In Ouagadougou, President Traore had gathered with his ministers. There was an atmosphere of excitement in the meeting room. Mr. President, you should have seen Hoffman's face, said Foreign Minister Ouedraogo, smiling. The man was completely shocked. Traore tried to suppress his smile. That's not what's important. What's important is maintaining our independent policy. We need to expand the Daam program even further. But what will the EU's reaction be? Asked Finance Minister Diallo. They could impose economic sanctions. They won't, said Traore determinedly, because now they understand that we are no longer a country that can be easily directed as before, and remember, they need us too. Our natural resources, our strategic position. The EU cannot afford to lose Burkina Faso. 3 days later, at the Europe-Africa Cooperation Summit in Berlin, an unexpected development occurred. EU Commission President Helga Müller said in her opening speech, "We need to turn a new page in European-African relations. We need to move away from the donor-recipient model and move towards real partnerships. African countries have the right to chart their own course and make their own decisions." There were surprised whispers among the delegates. This represented a radical change in the EU's Africa policy, and everyone saw the crisis with Burkina Faso behind this. After the speech, Helga Müller approached Ibrahim Traore. Press members immediately surrounded them. "Mr. President," said Müller, extending her hand, "I would like to talk about a new model of cooperation on the basis of equal partnership and mutual respect." Traore shook Müller's hand and smiled. "I welcome this new approach from the European Union, Madam President. I think we should thank Mr. Hoffman for initiating this dialogue. A slight laughter was heard in the hall. Everyone knew how Hoffman's diplomatic gaffe had caused a crisis. Müller also smiled, a bit tensely. Yes, sometimes we need to take hard lessons to learn. 2 weeks later, Burkina Faso's Daam program was showcased by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, as a model example for sustainable agriculture in Africa. The program began to attract the interest of other African countries as well. Delegations from Mali, Chad, and Senegal came to Ouagadougou to examine the program. Traore personally welcomed them and shared Burkina Faso's experiences. What we were always told was that we couldn't develop without outside help, Traore said in his speech. But we proved that this is not true. With our own resources, our own knowledge, and our own determination, we can chart our own path. The Malian Prime Minister put his hand on Traore's shoulder. You inspire us, brother. Africa's future lies not in models imposed from outside, but in solutions we create ourselves. This speech made headlines across the African press. Burkina Faso's independence lesson was featured in many newspapers across the continent. 6 months later, a new agreement was signed between the European Union and Burkina Faso. But this time, the terms were very different. The agreement was based on mutual investment and technology sharing, and envisioned a governance structure where both sides had equal say. Gustav Hoffman was also present at the signing ceremony. He was no longer the special representative for African affairs. He had been assigned to a lower-profile position in Brussels. Still, he had shown the courage to attend the ceremony. After the agreement was signed, Traore and Hoffman had a brief, private conversation. Mr. President, said Hoffman, I apologize for what I said in that meeting. It was ignorant and arrogant. Traore nodded. What's important is that we learn lessons, Mr. Hoffman, both you and us. Your Daam program is really impressive, Hoffman continued. No one thought you would succeed. That was the problem, said Traore. No one believing in us, but now we believe in ourselves. And that changes everything. Hoffman nodded thoughtfully. Africa is changing, isn't it? Yes, Traore confirmed. And the world has to adapt to it. A year later, the Daam program had begun to spread throughout Africa. 12 African countries had implemented similar programs. Food production was increasing, imports were decreasing, and the quality of life in rural areas was rising. The international media called this development Africa's silent revolution, and everyone remembered how this revolution had emerged from a diplomatic crisis, the arrogant words of a European diplomat, and the determined stance of an African leader. In Ouagadougou, in Ibrahim Traore's office, a new photograph now hung. On the wall, an exuberant image of villagers celebrating the first harvest of the Daam program. Under the photograph was a handwritten note. Independence is not just a word, it is an action. And every morning, Traore would look at this photograph before starting the day's work. It reminded him of what was possible, of how Africa could take control of its own destiny. Gustav Hoffman's insulting words had produced an unexpected result. They had strengthened Burkina Faso's true independence. Sometimes, the greatest changes arise from the most unexpected sparks. And the spark lit that day in the meeting room had now turned into a fire illuminating all of Africa.